This is the beginning of the Carolingians. Carolus is the Latin word for Charles. So the first one of these Carolingians was Charles Martel. His grandson, Charlemagne, from the French Charlemagne, Charles the Great, was the greatest of these Carolingian kings. In Latin, that's Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great. And so he starts the Carolingian dynasty. He was also the greatest ruler. Now, the main story of Charlemagne that I want us to understand is Charlemagne is a great example of these three cultures mixing. He was a solid Germanic warrior. He wanted glory. He wanted to fight. He wanted loot. But he was also a sincere Christian, and a much more intelligent one and real Christian than Clovis was. Clovis just wanted to be a Christian so he could win battles. Charlemagne really does seem to have meant it. And he was also a Roman because he wanted to not just be a king, he wanted to be a Roman emperor. So Charlemagne is this great example of these three cultures mixing, a mix of Roman, German, and Christian to form a new medieval culture. That's the main point for us to look at and understand when we look at Charlemagne. How does he show himself as a Christian? How does he show himself as a Roman? And how does he show himself as a German? Key points. First point, warfare. Good Germanic rulers fight, and Charlemagne was nothing if not a good Germanic ruler. He fought throughout most of his reign. In Saxony, which is in modern Germany, he fights for 33 years. 33 years. He goes back every year. There's a little bit of a religious tint. So here's him acting like a Christian, right? He's fighting for loot and glory and to rule people and all that. But one of the things he tries to do is he tries to force the Saxons to convert to Christianity. It doesn't go well. Forcing people to convert usually doesn't work so well. So what happens is he beats them in battle, he forces them to convert, and he goes home. When he goes home, they convert right back to being pagans. So this is why he spends 33 years going back and forth fighting, trying to make them convert, going home, going back to fight again. So that's a good instance of Charlemagne acting like a German, but also kind of a Christian too, in the sense that he tries to make them convert to Christianity. He conquers most of Italy. He actually goes there to help defend the Pope, a good way to get a good relationship with the church. And after conquering place after place, he makes a visit to Rome. Remember, he was a sincere Christian. And so he decides it's time for him to go to Rome to pay a visit to the Pope. So it's the year 800. Charlemagne has been ruling for some time. He goes to Rome. It's Christmas in the year 800. He says, well, it's Christmas, good Christian. He goes to church. He goes to church on Christmas Day, and he kneels down to pray, as, one would in church on Christmas Day. And he's surprised to find that the Pope sneaks up behind him and puts a crown on his head and says, I, the Pope, hereby declare you, Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charlemagne's like, what? Who, me? What do you mean? Holy Roman Emperor? Oh, well, okay, I guess. So on Christmas Day in the year 800, the Pope crowns Charlemagne, not king, emperor, Holy Roman Emperor. So again, here's Charlemagne presenting himself as a Roman emperor. This is where you get the Roman culture mixing in. There's an interesting debate. Did Charlemagne really want the Pope to do this? Because in one of the biographies of him, Charlemagne's like, why did he have to do that? I didn't want to be crowned emperor. But on the other hand, is that Charlemagne just trying to look humble and, pretend that he really didn't want to, when would the Pope really have done that if Charlemagne didn't want him to? Probably not, but we don't really know for sure. So Charlemagne is now not just king of the Franks, he is Holy Roman Emperor. So he's a German warrior, Christian, holy, but he's also calling himself a Roman emperor again. It's like he's trying to bring back the Roman Empire. And actually, his territory becomes called the Holy Roman Empire. He continues to expand, gains a lot of wealth, and then reaches a stopping point. It's like his empire got big enough. Now it's time to figure out how to rule it. So it is interesting that as a German, he calls himself a Roman emperor. It shows how much he admired Rome, and he didn't want to destroy Rome. He wanted to become Roman while still being a good German. Now, he's established, obviously, a very large empire. And remember, this is the time before phones or modern communication. How do you rule an empire this large and have communications? Well, he actually comes up with a very reasonable, organized plan. Shows him as a good governor. He divides his whole empire into 300 counties. Counties, like we have that term, county, Albany County, Rensselaer County, Schenectady County. Well, a county is a territory ruled by a count. And so there was one count in charge of each of these 300 counties, and that count had to report back to Charlemagne. The count's job was to carry out the laws, was to gather Charlemagne's armies. When Charlemagne wanted to go to war, he would tell his counts, all right, boys, time for war. And the job of the count was to collect taxes. And in exchange, Charlemagne gave them not just loot at this point, but land. So there's a little bit of a shift. Now you're trading land for loyalty. This is taking us to the development of feudalism, which we'll talk about more later. Point worth watching. Now, here's the thing. Charlemagne's appointed his counts. How does he know those counts are actually going to behave themselves? That's a bit of a problem. He has to trust them, but he also wants to keep an eye on them. So Charlemagne comes up with a second group, the Missi Dominici. It's the main job of the Missi Dominici to keep an eye on the counts, to make sure the counts are not getting themselves into trouble. Their job is to travel around the empire, to check on the counts, and to hear if people have any complaints. So the Missi Dominici went in pairs. One of them would be a secular meaning non-religious, he would just be a government official, and the second one would be a man of the church. The reason for this is almost nobody could read during this time period. The church is almost the only ones who could read. So you had to send around a person of the church too, so he could actually write the complaints down and send them back to Charlemagne. And so the job of these Missi Dominici, that means Latin for messengers of the Lord, that is like they're Charlemagne's messengers, was to travel around, to go to a county, to investigate. Does anyone have any problems with the count? If they do, they can report it to the Missi Dominici, and the Missi Dominici would pass it on to Charlemagne. It's a great way for Charlemagne to keep an eye on the counts and make sure they're being reliable. Then the counts also know Charlemagne is keeping an eye on them. It encourages them to behave themselves. It's a pretty good system, at least for a while. So this is a short introduction to Charlemagne. We've talked about how the Carolingians come to power. The Merovingians, the dynasty of Clovis, gradually loses power because they stopped fighting. They got too comfortable. Well, once they stop fighting, they lose respect. They can't reward their followers. So the next dynasty, the Carolingians, start to take over. The mayors of the palace, the major domos, Charles Martel is the first one, starts fighting again. He starts gradually collecting power to himself. His son, Pepin the Short, asks the Pope for permission to take over. Pope says yes. And so Pepin the Short mounts a coup, takes over, and now the Carolingians are the rulers of the Franks. The greatest of these Carolingians was Charlemagne, who was a mix. He was a German warrior, but he was also a Christian, and he wanted to be a Roman emperor. So he has himself declared Holy Roman Emperor. He even rules like a Roman emperor, coming up with a good system of government to try to keep an eye on things. In our next video, we will look at the Carolingian Renaissance. What else does Charlemagne do while he is ruling France to try to bring light to the dark ages.